It began with a whisper, an unusual absence, an unexpected appearance, and a secret that spiraled out of control. Princess Anne, the iron-willed matriarch of the royal bloodline, was seen where she was explicitly told not to be beside Catherine, in full view of cameras, at an event the king had forbidden. What could drive a woman of such discipline to defy the crown itself? The answer may change everything we thought we knew about the Windsor family before we go deeper into what this really means. For the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Whispers began days before the event. Inside the palace, aides noticed an unusual tension lingering in the air. Plans were shifting, meetings were being cancelled. Someone had gone silent. Charles's inner circle moved with unspoken urgency, yet no official announcements were made. It wasn't until a leaked memo circulated among senior staff that the truth became undeniable. King Charles had issued a direct and absolute order. No senior royal was to attend the event in question. His words were not merely a suggestion, they were final. The event, deeply tied to a controversial chapter in the monarchy's past, had already caused friction. To Charles, it represented risk. To Catherine, it represented something far deeper: loyalty, remembrance, and quiet resistance. Catherine's decision came as no surprise to those closest to her. Though no formal statement was made, her silence in response to the king's directive spoke volumes. A trusted aide, under condition of anonymity, revealed that Catherine had already committed to attending weeks earlier, privately, discreetly, but with certainty. The event was not just a gesture. It was personal, and as the day drew nearer, her calmness grew colder. She would not turn away, even if it meant walking alone. Then came the sudden disappearance from the official calendar. Princess Anne, who had been listed to attend a separate engagement in Scotland, abruptly cleared her schedule. No reason was given, no explanation offered. It was as if she had vanished into a shadow, but it didn't take long for speculation to ignite. Royal correspondents noticed the silence. Paparazzi intensified their surveillance. What was Princess Anne hiding? When the blurry photos surfaced, it sent shockwaves through every newsroom in Britain. There she was, Princess Anne, standing beside Catherine, at the very event King Charles had forbidden. The image was grainy, captured in haste, but unmistakable. The Princess Royal, the very embodiment of duty and discipline, had just committed the ultimate act of royal defiance. Together, they stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder. No words spoken, no need to explain. The image did all the talking. Within hours, the media descended into a frenzy. Headlines flooded every platform. Anne breaks the crown's command. Catherine stands firm, Anne joins her. Analysts debated the implications. Former palace insiders claimed this was the most direct act of rebellion since Edward VIII's abdication. Others called it the beginning of a new royal chapter 1, where tradition bows to truth. But as the cameras flashed and the headlines screamed, it wasn't the what that shocked insiders, it was the why that shattered the monarchy's fragile facade. Behind gilded palace doors, King Charles issued one of his most controversial edicts, banning all senior royals from a remembrance event linked to Diana, veiled under the guise of protocol. But this was no ordinary function. It was a symbolic reclamation, orchestrated quietly by Catherine, and meant to resurrect a legacy the crown was desperate to suppress. For months, the planning happened in silence, phone calls not made from royal residences, meetings held in borrowed rooms, names left off official records. The memorial had been proposed by a discreet circle of Diana loyalists, former aides, old friends, and public figures who once stood shoulder to shoulder with the Princess of Wales in her crusades for justice and compassion. Their goal was simple: commemorate Diana's humanitarian work on the 30th anniversary of her landmark speech against landmines. It was to be intimate but pointed, and it was Catherine, not the king, who gave the effort its soul. Behind palace walls, whispers grew louder. Charles had learned of the plans not through royal protocol, but through intercepted chatter from his communications team. At first, he dismissed it just another well-meaning but unofficial tribute. But when Catherine's name surfaced as a key figure behind the scenes, everything changed. Memories he had buried clawed back to the surface. Diana's ghost had haunted his reign from day one. He feared this memorial would do more than revive her memory. It would reopen the wounds of public judgment, rekindle the impossible comparison, and reposition Catherine as the heir to Diana's halo. The order came swiftly, with no room for interpretation. Senior working royals are not to attend. It was a command disguised as decorum. In private meetings, Charles insisted it was about avoiding headlines, about staying neutral, about keeping the monarchy above emotional spectacle. But no one in that room believed it. Least of all Catherine. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. Instead, she simply nodded and continued with her plans. Sources say she made one call afterward to Princess Anne. What was said during that conversation has never been confirmed, but what followed was a string of intense meetings in the palace, whispers of tension behind locked doors, briefings that ended abruptly. And through it all, Anne remained silent. Not a word in defense of the king's edict. Not a single agreement. But not a public rejection either. Just silence, cold, deliberate, watchful. Royal aides began to speculate. Was Anne withdrawing from her schedule on purpose? Why had she cancelled her upcoming trip to Edinburgh at the last minute? And why was she seen leaving Catherine's residence under the cover of night? None of it made sense until the day of the memorial, when everything did, but what no one expected was that Princess Anne, family's staunchest enforcer of duty, would break ranks, and do so with eyes wide open. She was the rock of the monarchy, a soldier, a strategist, a sister. But on that morning, Princess Anne tore through decades of loyalty with one decision. She walked into that event with Catherine not as a princess, but as a woman finally choosing heart over hierarchy. Something had broken long before Charles's command. This wasn't just rebellion. It was release. In the quiet days that followed the king's directive, Anne was not the same. Those who knew her best said she moved with a stillness that hinted at turmoil beneath. For a woman known to charge forward with resolve, this pause was unsettling. Her silence in official meetings had been noted, but it was the look in her eyes, detached yet burning, that told a deeper story. Behind the facade of routine, Anne was unraveling the line between duty and conscience. She wasn't defying the crown for headlines or spectacle. She was confronting a truth that had lived inside her since the day Diana died, and now it was demanding a reckoning. It was during a private conversation at Kensington Palace just days before the memorial that Catherine laid everything bare. Their meeting, away from cameras, lasted less than an hour, but it cracked open something Anne had kept buried for years, the guilt of silence, the weight of watching the institution fail women who didn't fit the mold. Catherine didn't beg, she didn't plead. She simply spoke the truth of what Diana meant to her, of what this memorial meant to others, and of the cost of obedience. When Anne left that room, she was no longer undecided. She was changed. One evening later, Anne's longtime personal secretary found her alone, standing at the window of her private residence. When asked what she was thinking, Anne replied coldly, "He's not mother, and he never will be." There was no anger in her voice, just finality. That one sentence, never meant for public ears, was the first crack in the dam that had long held back Anne's defiance. It wasn't just about Charles's failure to lead, it was about his failure to listen, to understand, to recognize that loyalty isn't blind obedience, but principled strength. The day of the memorial, Anne stepped out of the car beside Catherine, dressed in an outfit that drew immediate comparison to Diana's final public appearance. It was not a coincidence. It was a statement. Her subtle nod to the past was a thunderclap to those who understood symbolism. And yet, she said nothing. No speech, no formal greeting, just her presence, quiet, resolute, unshakable. Together, they moved through the crowd like two halves of a share. Pain finally acknowledged. One detail stood out above all else. A bystander whose testimony quickly made waves online recalled a fleeting moment where Anne gently reached for Catherine's hand and gave it a brief, firm squeeze. It lasted only seconds, but it shattered royal protocol into pieces. That gesture, a silent vow of solidarity, spoke more than any press release ever could. The monarchy had always feared what would happen if Anne turned her back on the crown, but the consequences would prove even more personal than political. The king's wrath wasn't loud, it was cold. When news of Anne's defiance reached his desk, Charles didn't raise his voice. He closed a door. Inside that room, aides describe a monarch unraveling not from betrayal, but from humiliation. He hadn't just been disobeyed, he had been outmaneuvered by the only sibling who knew how to dismantle him from the inside. The first image arrived with no warning. A tabloid editor texted it to one of Charles's advisors before it hit the morning front pages. There, unmistakably, was Princess Anne shoulder to shoulder with Catherine at the very event Charles had expressly forbidden. The king froze. The silence that followed in the royal study was described as suffocating. He stared at the photo for nearly a minute before slowly turning it face down. The betrayal didn't come from rebels or outsiders. It came from his sister, his most disciplined, most duty-bound ally had crossed a line drawn in royal blood. Charles summoned Camilla and his senior advisors for an emergency meeting. Behind tightly closed tempers flared. The king didn't shout, but his words cut sharper than any scream. One aide later confided that Charles whispered something that sent chills across the room. She's declared war, not on the institution, but on his reign, on his authority, on the fragile balance he believed he still controlled. The quiet fury rising within him wasn't just about Anne's presence at the event, it was about what it symbolized, a shifting of power, a challenge to the throne's emotional legitimacy. Within the hour, the palace press office was in chaos. Frantic calls to trusted media outlets, strategic leaks about protocol violations, but nothing could contain the tidal wave. The image had gone viral. The public wasn't condemning Anne, they were celebrating her. Every attempt at damage control made it worse. The more the palace tried to explain, the more obvious it became. The king was no longer in command of the narrative. And in the silence that followed, Camilla struck. She urged Charles to make an example, to publicly reprimand Anne, to show the monarchy hadn't fractured under emotion. But Charles hesitated. He knew Anne wasn't just another royal, she was a force. A symbol of stability the monarchy couldn't afford to alienate. Punishing her would risk internal collapse. Yet doing nothing would expose his vulnerability. So he chose a middle path, a personal letter, hand-delivered, sealed with his crest. It didn't contain rage. It contained a warning. This breach will not be forego. T10. It was more than a reprimand. It was a declaration of memory, one that would fester and resurface in darker times. But the war had already moved beyond the palace walls and into the hearts of the public, who began to choose sides. As Anne and Catherine stood together, an unspoken truth rippled through the crowd. This was the monarchy people wanted. Not guarded, not manipulated, but real, grieving, united. Social media exploded. Street chants began. And in that one unsanctioned moment, Anne and Catherine earned a loyalty no royal decree could command. Within minutes of the first footage hitting the internet, timelines ignited like wildfire. Posts flooded in images of Anne's resolute expression beside Catherine's steady gaze were reshared with millions of captions that felt more like cries of relief than rebellion. People weren't just watching a moment, they were witnessing a movement. Hashtags erupted, hashtag Anne stands tall, and hashtag Queens in Waiting surged across platforms in unison. Users who hadn't spoken of the royals in years suddenly found themselves captivated. And it wasn't just royalists praising their defiance, it was the skeptics, the Republicans, those long disillusioned by tradition, who found themselves unexpectedly moved. For once, the monarchy didn't feel scripted. It felt human. Crawl. DS gathered outside palace gates, not in protest, but in plea. Chants echoed through the streets, not demanding answers, but applauding courage. Handmade signs declared loyalty not to the own, but to two women who had quietly rewritten its meaning. It was as if, for the first time in decades, the people could see through the veil, and they chose authenticity over artifice. Public forums filled with debate. Some said it was a constitutional crisis. Others called it the revival of a royal soul that had been asleep since Diana's death. Either way, one truth became clear: something irreversible had begun. The media shifted almost overnight. Where tabloids once hunted scandal, they now sought sentiment. Headlines that would have condemned Anne and Catherine now read like endorsements. Duty redefined. The heart of the monarchy. Even anchors who had once leaned into palace PR now dared to question the king's silence. Editorials poured in, framing Anne and Catherine as pillars of emotional truth in a house that too often relied on cold tradition. It wasn't spin, it was sentiment turned tide. And behind closed doors, Charles felt every wave inside the palace. Aides reported an unfamiliar quiet around the king. Not rage, not disbelief. Just an overwhelming, silent realization that the grip he thought he held was slipping. One insider described him as haunted, watching replays of the event not with anger, but with a kind of hollow recognition. Charles understood what many refused to admit: he had been eclipsed not by scandal or rebellion, but by sincerity. The weight of public favor was no longer his to command, and it was falling into hands he couldn't control, not through politics but through presence. Not through power, but through purpose. But as the world rallied behind Anne and Catherine inside the palace, another royal felt the ground shake. Beneath her heels, Camilla had fought tooth and nail to ascend the royal mountain, but in one afternoon, Anne and Catherine brought it crashing down. Sources claim Camilla exploded behind closed doors, accusing Anne of sabotage and Catherine of manipulation. But in the shadows of her fury lay one chilling truth: no one feared her authority anymore. The moment the photo went viral and the crowd outside the palace began chanting names that didn't include hers, Camilla's composure cracked. Insiders said the queen consort retreated to her private quarter in silence, only to unleash a storm no aid had witnessed before. Rage consumed her. She reportedly blamed Anne for orchestrating the entire spectacle and labeled Catherine a quiet assassin in her tirade. It wasn't just anger, it was panic disguised as fury. Because for the first time since donning her crown, Camilla felt invisible, outplayed, overshadowed by two women who didn't need a title to hold power behind the scenes. She moved quickly to reassert control. Within hours, she began lobbying trusted advisors to recommend Catherine's exclusion from select upcoming state duties, anything that could weaken her public visibility. It was subtle, almost diplomatic, but undeniably calculated. The request wasn't made in official briefings but read through inner circles, wrapped in concern for optics. She wasn't just pushing back, she was striking back. And yet, every move made her desperation more transparent. Staff described her as volatile, erratic, and above all, terrified. One insider claimed she threw a government briefing binder across the room during a closed-door strategy meeting, shouting that the crown is being hijacked by emotion. The rift between her and Charles widened with each passing day. The king, reeling from the global praise for Anne and Catherine, reportedly urged caution. He refused to denounce his sister or his daughter-in-law publicly, much to Camilla's horror. Their confrontation, though private, was said to be explosive. She demanded action. He offered restraint. She demanded control. He gave her silence. And that silence cut deeper than any dismissal. Because for Camilla, this wasn't just about protocol, it was about survival. She had spent years crawling out from the shadow of scandal, only to be dragged back into the margins by two women who didn't even try to seize the spotlight. They simply earned it. From that moment forward, paranoia settled like fog around her. Every interaction was second-guessed. Every whisper a threat. She became convinced that Anne and Catherine were building something bigger than one event, something permanent. She suspected staff were switching allegiances, that Charles was being pulled emotionally toward a narrative she couldn't control. And as she paced the halls of Clarence House, her grip on the royal future began to loosen, finger by finger, while Camilla plotted in the shadows. Anne stepped into the light once more, and this time with a plan forged long ago. This defiance wasn't born overnight. It was seeded in sorrow, watered by injustice, and sealed in a whispered promise at a Windsor corridor years ago. Anne and Catherine had been building toward this moment, not for rebellion, but for redemption. And what they were about to reveal could rewire the future of the monarchy. It began long before the headline, before the fractured briefings, before Charles's ban, before the cameras caught them standing side by side. It began at a funeral. Diana's funeral. While the world focused on the two grieving sons, few noticed Anne's stoic, restrained, but inwardly shattered. She had seen the way the institution turned its back on a woman who had once lit up the very walls it now mourned her in. And she had watched with aching clarity the silence that followed. That silence embedded itself within her, never forgotten. Years later, after Queen Elizabeth's passing, Anne found herself navigating the same hall, with Catherine, two women tied by duty, haunted by expectation, and quietly disillusioned. It was during those early days of transition that something unspoken began to take form. They were often the last two in the room after a briefing. The only voices questioned why decisions were made without feeling, without instinct, without people in mind. Their bond was immediate, but it was unbreakable. It was forged not from friendship, but from understanding. And as Charles began to tighten his grip on the crown, centralizing decisions and marginalizing perspectives that did echo his own, Anne and Catherine grew restless. They began meeting quietly, away from official calendars. Kensington Palace became more than a residence. It became a meeting ground. Over 18 months, ideas turned to intentions. Intentions turned to strategy. They spoke of service, not spectacle, of legacy, not lineage. They drafted plans, discussed public sentiment, and plotted a subtle recalibration of what it meant to be royal in the modern age. They didn't call it a revolution, but they both knew that if the moment ever came, they would not hesitate to act. Their biggest frustration wasn't personal, it was structural. Charles had become obsessed with control, surrounding himself with loyalists, pushing aside independent thought. The monarchy was becoming smaller, colder, less human. Anne, who had once been his greatest enforcer, now saw herself drifting toward a different truth. Catherine, always measured, now felt a calling greater than protocol. They began talking not about breaking tradition, but returning to its roots, a monarchy of presence, of compassion, of truth. Diana's values reborn, not through rage, but through resolve, and then came the agreement. It was never written down, but both remembered the moment it was made. If the line is drawn, Anne had said, "We stand together." Catherine nodded, not in fear, but in clarity. The line was finally drawn when Charles issued his order, and from that moment, there was no turning back. They weren't rebelling, they were honoring a promise, but as the alliance strengthened, Charles made a desperate move, one final attempt to restore control, no matter the cost. Corn, red, humiliated, and politically exposed, King Charles played his final card. In a private meeting, he warned Anne of dire consequences and floated the unthinkable, stripping Catherine of future succession responsibilities. What followed wasn't just a family fallout. It was a constitutional tremor. And Anne's reply would become legendary. It began with an unannounced summons, Sandringham, a place Charles often reserved for reflection and strategy, now transformed into a backdrop for confrontation. Anne arrived alone. No aides, no fanfare, just decades of shared history and a chasm that had never been wider. Charles greeted her with civility, but the warmth was gone. The conversation began politely, dressed in vague language and laced with regret, but the illusion didn't last long. The king, weary of optics and fearing loss of control, laid out his final warning. He wanted Anne to distance herself from Catherine. He wanted her to issue a statement reaffirming allegiance to the crown and by omission condemning the woman now seen as a symbol of royal insubordination. But it didn't stop there. With slow, deliberate precision, Charles presented his true aim. He was considering a strategic review of future succession roles, an assessment that would, in effect, call into question Catherine's standing as the future queen consort. He framed it as procedural, a necessary act of preserving unity. But Anne saw it for what it was, a punishment, a threat wrapped in protocol. And when she didn't immediately respond, he doubled down. He made it clear that if she refused to recant, he would go public. Not just about the review, but about Anne's role in the defiance. He'd portray her as the catalyst, the instigator, the traitor. Anne didn't blink. She listened, unmoved, until the king was done. Then, with the same cold fire she had carried into that memorial, she delivered a sentence that would echo through royal history. If you silence her, you silence the crown itself. There was no escalation, no yelling, just a truth so sharp it left no room for argument. She stood, nodded once, and left. The message was clear. Her loyalty was not negotiable, and neither was Catherine's place in the future of the monarchy. Within days, word of the meeting leaked. It wasn't just gossip, it was an explosion. Members of Parliament began raising questions. Constitutional scholars warned of potential overreach. Headlines no longer spoke of rebellion, but of royal instability. The phrase succession crisis began appearing in newspapers, whispered in political circles, debated on primetime panels. For a family built on image and order, this was unprecedented territory. Inside the palace, panic surged. Communications teams scrambled to contain the narrative. Advisors begged Charles to issue a statement of unity, but he remained silent, paralyzed between pride and pressure. Meanwhile, Anne and Catherine grew more powerful not by speaking, but by standing still. They didn't explain, they didn't defend, and the silence from their side became deafeningly eloquent. And just when it seemed the monarchy might fracture beyond repair, a twist emerged from the shadows that turned the entire royal narrative upside down. A document long hidden, a final message from the late Queen Elizabeth II. As pressure mounted and public sentiment turned, a sealed envelope emerged containing her last private will. In it, a message of trust, of legacy, and of unwavering belief in two women, Anne and Catherine. What it said would end one reign and ignite the next. The atmosphere inside Windsor Castle had grown unbearably tense. After weeks of media chaos, constitutional panic, and royal silence, few believed any path forward could restore faith in the monarchy. But deep in the royal archives, in a vault reserved for the Queen's most personal correspondences, lay an envelope. It had been untouched since her passing, marked not with the royal crest, but with a single word, personal. For months, the contents were unknown. Not even Charles had dared to open it. It was the Queen's final request that it only be read if the crown itself begins to crack. Now, there was no denying it, the fracture had come. The executor of her private estate, a long-time confidant and keeper of her handwritten archives, stepped forward. In a meeting so secret only 3 people attended, the envelope was opened. What lay inside was not wealth, not titles, but words, a message not to divide, but to guide. And its power would outshine every speech. the palace had ever scripted. Queen Elizabeth, in her steady, unmistakable handwriting, had written, "Anne is my anchor. Catherine is my future." She acknowledged the changing tides of public trust and emphasized the need for authenticity, compassion, and courage. She spoke of Diana, of legacy, and of the quiet strength both Anne and Catherine carried when the world wasn't watching. She didn't just name them, she entrusted them. To Anne, she passed the torch of institutional resilience. To Catherine, the emotional compass of a nation. One line in particular stunned those in the room. "Let her guide with empathy where others rule with protocol. The people will follow where truth leads." It was a clear and direct endorsement not just of Catherine's character, but of her rightful place in the royal future. It was also, in its silence, a correction of the chaos Charles had unleashed. The contents were never meant to be made public, but the leak was swift, perhaps intentional. Within hours, excerpts from the Queen's words found their way into press headlines. "Catherine is my future. Anne is my anchor." Public support surged like a tidal wave. The nation wasn't just moved, it was galvanized. Parliament members who once called for clarification now demanded the king stand down for internal interference. Commentators began calling the Queen's letter the true transition of power. Faced with a wall of reverence that not even a monarch could climb over, Charles retreated, quietly, completely. Meetings were cancelled, press briefings delayed. And for the first time since the crisis began, the palace issued a statement, not in the king's name, but in the name of the institution. It praised Anne, it praised Catherine, and it echoed the late Queen's words unmistakably and without resistance. Anne and Catherine, once seen as supporting figures, emerged not just as survivors, but as symbols. Their defiance had never been reckless, it had been written, foretold, anointed. And in the eyes of the nation, their loyalty to truth had become more powerful than any crown, and so, from defiance came destiny. In choosing loyalty to truth over tradition, Anne and Catherine did more than disobey the king. They redefined what royalty means in the eyes of a nation. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.